Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. So before I start the seminar, I'm going to call on my colleague, Ravi. We are going to have a short release of a very important volume of Pratiman, which is a special keywords edition of Pratiman. And so Ravi, will you join me here and introduce the volume?
Oh, we'll have a proper launch later next month. So this is a soft launch. And this is a translation. This is a departure from the usual Riti and Niti of Pratima. This is, all of it is a translation of the keywords issue in Hindi. And so many people have worked on this. I can't name them right now, but I want those who have been working here in the editorial team, in the production team, to come here so that we can have a photo. Okay. As it says, Dakshin Asia film व media अध्ययन के बीच शब्द. So these are keywords for, of, from, film and media studies in South Asia. There are 45 keywords. And we hope that this will grow because we'll put this up online and people will contribute their own terms in future, hopefully, and it'll continue to grow. So this came out in 21 during COVID time, the original issue, English issue, and of Bioscope, yeah. And this one, we have worked for almost 2 years on this. Come. How? Dinesh, Ashutosh, Chandan. Deepu also claims he is not designed. So Deepu, please join. The original editors can also join. Huh? Everybody hold one copy.
पीछे कर लो भाई कैमरा
ठीक है
सारे लोग नहीं आ रहे
नहीं आ रहे ये कौन तुम क्यों नहीं आ रहे थैंक यू थैंक यू
Thank you. So now we will start our seminar, and I want to introduce Akshya Saxena, who's Associate Professor of English at Vanderbilt. So Akshya is the author of Vernacular English, Reading the Anglophone in Postcolonial India from Princeton University Press, which won the 2023 Modern Language Association's Prize for Outstanding First Book. She's also the editor of Thinking with an Accent Towards New Object, Method, and Practice, which won again, the Rene Wellek Prize for the first edited collection. That's a big opener start. So congratulations, and I'm looking forward to your lecture. But what I want to do first, with your permission, I'll say a few words. This event is a CSDS event, but it also overlaps the interests of two programs, the Indian language program, the volume you just saw, the Sarai program, and it also opens up social and political questions that are pertinent to a lot of the scholarship of people in this room. So one of the things I think when when people outside a discipline read a book, it means something has moved. And that's, I think, the great value of vernacular English. I mean, I just read it and I couldn't stop. I read it over 2 days. And I want to talk about what interested me. So this is kind of a personal reaction because it's not a disciplinary reaction. And I think vernacular, the notion of the vernacular is very big in media scholarship. And the argument was this, that the vernacular is based on linguistic models, and which are seen as popular practices that react to dominant hierarchies. I mean, you have this very important work by Pierre Bourdieu on French popular photography. Then you have work of someone like Pollock, Sheldon Pollock, where Sheldon Pollock would contrast vernacular place with cosmopolitan space and ascribing vernacularization as choosing to, and I quote, a language that did not travel as easily as far as the well-traveled language of the old cosmopolitan order. So I myself, when I started reading a book, I was, as you know, I've been skeptical of this positioning of the vernacular. So I think what is most interesting for me is the book shifts the idea of the vernacular into a different plateau, which offers space for all of us in this room to enter. That's what I think scholarship should do. And I think what is very nice about the book was it was written without the conceptual baggage and the philosophical anxieties of the earlier generation, the kind of people we read when we were in university. And that is what is refreshing about the book. And I think all scholarship is like that. And for me, what is interesting is, okay, if language is material, it is no longer clearly representing a world, if it is material. So this allows this thing designated as English language as a vehicle for different mobilities. So it's an infrastructure, it's a structure of feeling. It also assembles bodies. And you have a very nice section where you talk about it. It assembles bodies. There are speakers, there are listeners, there are bystanders, gate crashers. And there is proximity. There is also this machinic instability because you don't know where it's going to go. You really don't know. And different kinds of people attach themselves. There are projects of diversion. People take it somewhere else. There's overturning. And what I liked is it's not a diagnostic form of analysis that you're entering in. You know, it's what Eve said you could have called weak theory. It's a kind of, you're trying to enter. And I think here, English for me is foreign. Of course, it's foreign, but ambient. It's everywhere. It's official and commercial. And it's allowing for these peculiar, unanticipated flipping of positions. You know, people in the South say we want English. It's bizarre kind of political aesthetics. So language as material is about really forms of life. That is what I really got a sense of it, you know, traveling with the book. And this major minor difference, this whole debate on Kafka, it's so fluid, especially when you write about Manipur. I felt it's fluid, it's moving. So if you read the book, and I would encourage everyone to read the book because it's an easy read. It's philosophically ambitious, but it's an easy read. So she's looking at the constitution, debates the constitution. She's looking at Dalit traditions relation to English. So there's Modi and Rohit Vemula, who staged the opening. It's a very nice opening. And then you have this protests in Manipur with an English banner in which only one person in the demo actually speaks English. So who's a speaker, who's a performer? And I think there's a section in the book which is particularly nice, which is where I really got, which is the sonic movement of language, where it becomes figure, where it's moving beyond the image, moving beyond the sign. It's a kind of flux. So the figure is something else, where it is moving into mediation. We don't know. So to close, it's a conceptually audacious intervention. That's why I wrote to her to come to CSDS, and I'm delighted that Diwali and the smoke brought you here. But I think it wears its theory. It's a very theoretical book, but wears it very lightly. You won't feel it at all, without the citational anxiety that is flooding so much of academic writing. So I think it tells you that it's possible to write sophisticatedly and write well. So best of luck and all the best for your lecture.
Thank you so much. That was it means a lot to hear that you read the book and that you had all of this to say about it. So I'll begin by saying hi to all of you. Hi, everyone. I want to formally thank Professor Ravi Sundaram for inviting me and everyone who helped put this event together. For so many of us, as we were talking, CSDS and Sarai have shaped how we think about questions of media, publics, and cities. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share my work with all of you, where I specifically think about the place of language in these conversations. So just for context, speaking very broadly, my work, are you able to hear me? Okay. So speaking broadly, my work explores the relation of the page to different kinds of linguistic experiences, especially to what Rebecca Walkowitz has memorably called language as less than one, language at the limits of legibility, ability, expertise, and literacy. I'm particularly invested in the racialized and caste-marked practices of mediation that make a language intelligible in a multilingual landscape like India. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll draw out these preoccupations through a brief sketch of my work so far, and then turn to a discussion of poems by the Hindi poet Jacinta Kerketta, whose poems I argue demand that we read in the absence of a language. And by making that demand, these poems encourage a reconsideration of how we understand language itself. As a scholar of 20th and 21st century Indian literatures, I found that language, a named language, almost always appears as a political question first. Languages in India have inspired passionate responses, with people both killing and dying for them. Linguistic worlds and access to them remain at the heart of nearly everything: politics, education, health, environment, and technology. Whether it's the linguistic color line of English, the state's imposition of Hindi, the systemic endangerment and decimation of minority languages, or the multilingual and multimedia penumbra of the global. Language is always at the core of how power and belonging are organized. But two things are true at once. One, to read and write about India is to read and write about multilingual cultures. And two, languages are also disappearing. Whether that's the literal loss of speakers or the cultural hierarchization of less powerful languages in favor of other dominant ones through prioritization of written traditions, digital divides, and economic pressures. Thinking India and literature from this multilingualism can, of course, sharpen scholarly understanding of complex histories of bordering, migration, religion, as well as of class-marked, casteist, and gendered literary cultures. But it also leads us to a few bigger related questions. One, what can we as readers and scholars know about a language that we don't know? And two, how can we tell the story of a language presumed to be lost or a language we never knew? How do we bring it to the page? In many ways, as Ravi just explained, these questions about what can be known in and about language ground and extend from my first book, Vernacular English. As a comparative study of 20th and 21st century Indian English literature, it is not exactly a book about lost or endangered languages, but it does aim to think language from experiences that evade scholarly attention. A statistic I often encountered while writing it, both as criticism and as context, was that only about 10% of Indians are literate in English, that it is a language of an elite minority. But given the literary, visual, and sonic ubiquity of English in political slogans, outsourced telemarketing calls, classes in spoken English, and Bollywood films, I wondered how the other 90% of Indians who do not know English encountered and interpreted the language. And it seemed to me that when we thought of a global language, we imagined a world of readers, writers, and speakers who were completely immersed in that language to the detriment of their other linguistic skills, and did not consider the modalities and mediations of linguistic experience, like seeing a language, hearing it, touching it, and remembering it. So amid the principled and emotionally charged debates about the dominance of English, I wanted to tell a different story of English, of a language variously claimed across caste, class, and racial lines. I wanted to track this preeminently global language at the limits of literacy, among reading subjects who do not necessarily know what they read, and scenes where English was read by not being read at all. In the book, I examine the English language as part of India's multilingual local milieu, tracing its life through other languages besides English, through media forms besides literature, and through modes of reading and writing outside literature and literacy. Doing so shows how the sign of a colonial/global English makes invisible the relations between English and other languages, relations that strengthen a Hindu nationalist vision of the Indian state, as well as enable its contestations. I name the relations between the multilingual literary and media cultures and the hegemony of a metropolitan literary English that threatens to subsume it by framing English as a vernacular, by shrinking the scale of analysis, and pursuing three interlocking lines of inquiry. One, how does the English language live in other languages and media, like Hindi literature, bilingual bureaucratic documents, Bollywood films, and multilingual protest cultures, such that the boundaries between English and another language are almost always blurred? Two, how do these instances of translation/transmediation make the English language a contested site of caste, class, ethnic, and racial formation in India? And three, how must we, as scholars of media and literature is a media form, read the text that we do in the shadow of this vernacular life of English? By analyzing how embodied acts of listening, remembering, and speaking in local frameworks of intelligibility, I argue that how a language is used can defy its colonial or elite logics and contradict what it is conventionally supposed to represent. So for instance, I highlight English as one of India's associate official languages to show that its legislation in India's constitution symbolically protects various minority languages against the exclusive dominance of Hindi, while at the same time replacing those languages. On the other hand, in the spirit of what Laura Brueck has called flipping the analytical gaze, I study how Dalit writers have imagined and mobilized English as a language of democracy enshrined in the Indian Constitution, or how writers from the northeastern borderlands, because of a long history of state militarization, colonial ethnography, and Baptist missionary activity, use the Roman script of English to write non-English languages against Hindi as a dominant language. To return to my opening remarks, the question guiding vernacular English all along was what becomes intelligible as English, and how does the English language itself become intelligible, both in scholarly debates and in everyday life. And these questions can be asked about any language. To call English a vernacular is not simply to say that English is another Indian language or that English is suddenly not a language of power and dominance. Instead, vernacular is a way of retelling the story of English, of naming the colonial and global power structures associated with it without reinscribing them each time we discuss the language. And in that sense, it is a conceptual orientation that attends to the embodied and material mediations of English and notes the multivalent, fascist and liberatory desires to make common that animate English as eminently global and eminently translatable. Since completing the book, I found myself returning to two seemingly contradictory realizations about the reach of my argument. First, the story I tell in the book is not unique to India or English. Similar arguments could be made about English in other parts of the subcontinent and other erstwhile British colonies. We could also examine other languages for how they become politically legible. And yet, despite this conviction, I also find it hard to teach my students how to do this kind of comparative work when we don't share linguistic knowledges. Far too many times I've stood in the classroom discussing translations of literary texts written in languages that either only I know or only my students know. Though I experienced these moments in a US classroom, I found that colleagues in India describe similar struggles. Our conversations have brought into focus a paradox at the very heart of our work around language, which is that on the one hand, there is little formal support for language education. But on the other hand, our lives, our students' lives, and the worlds we inhabit are more multilingual than ever. And while we live in a time of unprecedented linguistic homogenization, it is also true that the monolingual logics of our institutions and critical methods are woefully out of step. I've come to think that our understanding of multilingualism needs reframing, perhaps even respecifying, if it is to meet the realities of our present. We need to think multilingualism not only through questions of access and acquisition of more languages as a profusion, but also through the absences that multilingualism must necessarily elide to secure linguistic knowledge. My current book project grows out of a desire to consider the promise as well as the limits of multilingualism by asking how languages without states, scripts, or speakers become legible in literature and in larger public discourse. This book looks to two main bodies of work as I'm conceptualizing it right now, to trace how language and the material world mutually transform one another to become readable on the page. So I want to look at 20th and 21st century global English and Hindi literature on the one hand, and cultural discourses of language in indigenous activist manifestos, national and international legal charters on minority rights, and reports on language, multilingualism, translation of organizations like the UNESCO, UNHCR, and Translators Without Borders. What I found striking thus far is that in both cases, both literary texts as well as these cultural discourses, language is often framed as something tangible to share, count, lose, or preserve. So discourses of human rights and language ecology borrow vocabulary from the world of environment, health, finance, service, and technology. And indigenous creative writers across the world often depict oppressed or endangered languages by referencing the loss of biodiversity to conceptualize the threat of language extinction. I want to think more in this book about how, against scholarly proclivities, language is constantly being made graspable, mappable, extractable, serviceable, and measurable through a materialist vocabulary and through the material world as artifact, data, service, resource, right, and land. And finally, I'm interested in how literary scholars might make sense of these understandings of language when reading literature or thinking multilingualism. Put briefly, I'm interested in the environments that make languages intelligible and the reading practices they call forth, so as to acknowledge both the worlds that multilingualism brings into view and the worlds that it obscures. In the time that I have left, I want to turn to Jacinta Kerketta's 2016 collection, Angor, to attempt an answer to how we might read a language that isn't written. Kerketta, for context, belongs to the Oraon Adivasi community from central India. Her poems in Angor and elsewhere in her writing confront what Ganesh Devi has called linguistic phonocide. Devi's work, along with Sahitya Academy's tribal language translation project, shows that the languages most at risk of phonocide, of stopped being spoken, are the ones spoken by marginalized tribes whose children either receive no education at all, or if they go to school, are taught in officially recognized languages. Today, many languages spoken by fewer than 100 people in Adivasi, nomadic, hill, island, and coastal communities teeter on the edge of extinction. Kerketta's Angor responds to this loss by turning what we know as language death into a scene of attention. It remediates phonocide by showing us communicative worlds built out of depletion and deprivation. Writing in Hindi, not to recover an Adivasi language, but to rethink what language itself can be, Kerketta imagines an unnamed, ecological, non-representational form of speech born from her relation to the forest. This other language of soil, of trees, of flowers, resists the extractive logics that destroy both forests and languages. It frustrates interpretive habits that seek to mine her poems for meaning, and instead casts the forest as a place not subject to the extraction of linguistic or mineral resources. And in doing so, it shows us how languages continue to live. I'd like to. Okay. So this is a cover of Kerketta's collection. I'll talk about it in a second. So Kerketta presents us with at least 3 linguistic orders in the collection. There's Hindi/English of the title. Then there are the languages that do not make it to the page because they either don't have scripts or she's just not chosen to write in them. And then there is an unnamed language of the forest. So to start tracing these languages, Angor, the collection title, means embers in Sadri, a language that's spoken in the region. Kerketta uses it to name the fire that she says she's felt throughout her life. She's a child of domestic abuse who lost her father in a land dispute with non-tribal folks and experienced discrimination and oppression as a young tribal girl in a non-tribal missionary-run school in Ranchi. So that's what the fire refers to. While the title is a word from Sadri, the collection was written in Hindi. Kerketta wrote in Hindi, and a group of translators collectively translated the poems into English and German. These poems and translations were published in Hindi and English by Adivani Press, a small press that's dedicated to publishing Adivasi writers in English. It has also been published in German and Italian, and all these translations, because they appear bilingually, multiply the languages by associating Hindi with English, with German, with Italian, and so on. So that's the German and the Italian translation book covers. The English translation of Angor are made by Bhumika Chawla D'Souza, Vijay K. Chabra, and Father Cyprian Ekka. The translations appear in a bilingual edition that announces that the poems are in Hindi/English, and that's what I was referring to, right under the title, Poetry in Hindi/English. Each poem appears on facing pages, so Hindi on the left and English on the right, under the shared label of Hindi/English. This typography makes visible the double dominance of Hindi and English, the administrative languages of the Indian state and the vernaculars of global capitalism. Through this doubled form, Angor inhabits the tension between visibility and erasure. Its circulation across Hindi and English and other European languages like German and Italian, of course, grants the poet legibility, but it also exposes how these very languages have also displaced the tribal and Adivasi languages from which the work itself emerges. Kerketta's poems lay bare the entwined violence of corporate extraction, state power, and displacement as they map the spectacular and slow violences of mining and extraction. In Lal Nadiyan, rivers of blood, the trees, rivers, and soil are stained with the toxic residue of the mine. In Sazishon Ki Sixth Lane, the 6 lanes of conspiracy, Kerketta condemns the corporate social responsibility programs like football leagues and youth clubs that distract young people from the theft of their land. And Saranda Ke Phool, the flowers of Saranda, offers a central experience of the native vegetation that's punctuated by blasts in mines. Across her writing, Kerketta often borrows figures and metaphors from the forest, and the poetic world itself is filled with the Adivasi community's relations with the natural world around them. With forced displacement from worlds that have long sustained them and pressures to participate in non-tribal economies, for many Adivasi communities, survival requires migration to cities and the adoption of Hindi and English as the languages of bureaucracy, courts, healthcare, labor, etc. The government, of course, offers no meaningful support for the preservation or transmission of tribal languages. Education systems don't necessarily serve oral traditions, and there is, of course, no cohesive national policy to protect them. And meanwhile, the corporate cultural programs, like the ones that Kerketta condemns, push Adivasi youth further away from their linguistic and cultural worlds. Kerketta herself speaks about 7 or 8 different languages today, but she grew up speaking Hindi, Santali, and Sadri. Her mother tongue is Kuruk, a vulnerable language according to UNESCO, which she formally came to understand only much later in life. She publishes her poems in Hindi/English and writes in Hindi because, and I quote her, the majority of the people in India understand 2 languages, Hindi and English, unquote. As Kerketta says in an interview, and as she's told me in personal conversations, very few people in her Adivasi community would understand their mother tongue, but can understand Hindi. Publishing in Hindi/English is also thus a tactical decision for Kerketta. Since her poetry pointedly condemns the exploitation of Adivasi people in India, she says it is politically necessary to write in a language that will be understood by those responsible for that exploitation and devastation. Ironically, the strategic use of Hindi/English also allows her visibility in national level literary festivals organized by Tata and Vedanta, the same corporations involved in the land grab projects in Saranda. As Angor shows us how literature moves through infrastructures of capital, it also presents language itself as a public infrastructure and the condition of comparison, arguably enacting a moment of crisis that illuminates their exertion of power. For the face-to-face translations of Angor, Hindi and English staring at each other across the page, do more than just present two translations of a poem. I'll shift to an example of that and then come back. So this is how the pages look. On the one hand, English and Hindi are both languages that Kerketta speaks and writes. These languages are part of her linguistic formation and experience. Hindi and English are also part of the story of displacement, depletion, and racial formation of tribes in India. Using English in a face-to-face translation that looks back at the Hindi versions, these poems challenge the resistance to exploring English as part of the multilingual landscape and highlight its vernacular energies. This is the argument I would have made in Vernacular English. And it is one that is borne out in the work of other Adivasi writers and activists, especially those invested in the discourse of global indigeneity, including Ruby Hembrum, who's the publisher of Adivani Press. But this is only part of the argument. For on the other hand, the face-to-face translations that turn to each other to confirm the meanings and the slash that indexes this relation bear reminders of linguistic cultures invisibilized and exploited by dominant languages. The proximity of Hindi and English in the Indian Constitution is an act of translation, as I've argued, that renders them commensurate to be claimed as representative of all other languages in India. In that sense, the slash creates a relation of orientation and facing that disappears languages like Sadri, Santali, Kuruk, Ho, and Munda as representable by Hindi/English and exploitable in Anglophone circulation economy. It is the slash, the violent tear between the two dominant languages of state and racial capitalism that Kerketta's poems grow out of and live. This is true because literally without education in these languages in a missionary school in Ranchi, Kerketta would presumably not have written in either language. But it is also figuratively true that Kerketta's poetry grows between Hindi and English as she writes about the worlds that capitalist state exploits and marginalizes. Barring a few nouns, Sadri, or any other language for that matter, does not feature in the collection significantly. But face-to-face translations, Hindi and English facing each other, thwart a traditional reading as Hindi and English, as they insistently evoke a linguistic absence. So for example, the poem Nadi, Pahad or Bazar, the river, the mountains, and the market, features the poet walking from the forest to the market, pointing to the new generation, the graveyards that used to be lush with trees, the mountains that have been blasted into the earth, and the rivers that have dried up. आगे देख जमीन पर बड़ी सी दरार, मैंने कहा इसी में समा गए सारे पहाड़, अचानक वो सहम के लिपट गई मुझसे, सामने दूर तक फैला था भयावह कब्रिस्तान, मैंने कहा देख रही हो इसे, यहीं थे कभी तुम्हारे पूर्वजों के खलियान. The translation is on the slide. So pay attention to the logics of showing worlds that have disappeared that are no longer visible. And similarly, in the poem that was up until just now, O Sheher, we read, भागते हुए छोड़कर अपना घर, पुआल, मिट्टी और खपरे पूछते हैं अक्सर, ओ शहर, क्या तुम कभी उजड़ते हो किसी विकास के नाम पर? So this loss of the lived and natural world that these poems describe affects the poet's linguistic world and community as well, of course. But as the poems describe the devastation, they also invite the interlocutor to see the scene of the page and face these disappeared sites, in a telling contrast to the facing translations. Even as the pages only feature Hindi and English, they invite the younger generation and the reader, in fact, to attend to the traces of what used to be there and what can perhaps be conjured again. Part of the seeing has to do with activating a different linguistic order of imagining language differently. So in this context, the poem Admi Ki Bhasha, the language of man, most emphatically departs from the traditional textual understanding of language. It describes language as part of a communicative milieu where a leaf communicates with a tree and the poet herself. The forest is a living entity, the conditions of language, and a companion to the poet. The poet tells us that this language shared by the inhabitants of the forest, it's not something that can be documented in the dastaवेज or documents in the cities. और जो दस्तावेजों में शब्दों की भीड़ भरने में व्यस्त हैं, उनके शब्द आज तक नहीं समझ सके, क्यों आदमी नहीं समझ पाता आदमी की ही भाषा. The use of the word dastaवेज calls to mind Prathama Banerjee's argument that, I quote, tribes and Adivasis are almost always invisible in modern state archives, where they surface only as objects of counterinsurgency and or policy, unquote. Indeed, it seems that colonial projects of language standardization and post-colonial projects of linguistic preservation, all of these, the poet suggests, miss something fundamental about the language of the people in the poem. It prevents humans from understanding other humans, from non-tribal people to understand the tribal and Adivasi people as humans. And here, it is important to remember that tribes and Adivasis have been seen by the state, as well as a lot of colonial scholarship, as objects, again, I'm citing from Prathama's work, as objects of administrative and anthropological inquiry and regulation, with very little possibility of them appearing as either historical or economic or literary or even religious subjects in their own right. Several other poems elaborate on this ecological linguistic order that I'm identifying and show how the language the poet prizes is actually neither Hindi nor English, but is nestled within and shaped by the landscapes of Saranda. So the poem Admi or Shabd, for instance, describes words as harvested from the fields of forefathers, soaking in the dew all night long in the winnowing basket on the straw roof of a village home. This poem particularly sets up two languages, the language of the city belonging to the man and the ecological language of the forest. The city's language is shiny and colorful from the outside, but hollow inside. And in contrast, the language of the forest pulses with the blood of the poet's ancestors. It gains meaning from generational history and from soaking the dew overnight. The depth of language, how far back it goes into history, is compared to the roots of trees that run deep. This ecological orientation of language of the forest connects with the human and non-human inhabitants. The focus on depth and the ground, of course, also bring to mind the insurgent activity in the region. But if language is not something to be contained within the pages of documents, if it is not written, then it also cannot be read in a way that relies on written language. Kerketta's poems challenge the logic of invisibility by presenting this material and ecological view of language that would otherwise be disappeared between the violent orientation of Hindi and English toward each other. In the poems that I've discussed, what is visible, what is plain to the eye, like the colorful words of the city that are hollow within, that's deceptive. What is significant is not present and perceptible. Instead, these verses shift our orientation as a reader and invite us to face language through the forests of Saranda, through the mahua flower, through words heavy with dew. What matters most is not what we can see, but what we must sense. And Kerketta's verses ask us to face language with the body, to feel the page as ground. With their vivid imagery and descriptions, the poems activate a visual register, which replaces the missing visual script of Sadri and other languages that don't make it to the page or don't have scripts. Language in Angor becomes meaningful only where it mediates the world of other languages. The Hindi/English that writes the poems is tactically helpful, of course, but this translational language is not commensurate to the language spoken by the poet. That language comes from the personal and ecological memory, which the mountains and flowers share with the human. We can think of the poems as working across two linguistic orders. The first is the language of man in the city, understood traditionally as Hindi or English. The second order of language is what I'm noting as ecological, from the earth, which stands for all of the poet's languages that don't appear on the page. This other language order can be made visible, rendered scriptural in an anti-extractivist move when we turn our gaze toward the forest and the scene of the page itself. In her 2017 book, The Extractive Zone, Macarena Gomez Barris reminds us that an anti-extractivist literary theory asks us not to search for some radical otherness outside capitalism, but to cultivate, I quote, a cognitive and embodied mode of seeing that apprehends submerged modes of existence in peripheral life worlds, unquote. It is my argument that Kerketta's poetry does this. It asks us to read through the red dust of the minds to see what lies beneath the Hindi/English, to glimpse the submerged linguistic worlds presumed to be lost. Her poems expose infrastructures that underwrite literary production, as well as the unwritten languages that it includes. By writing in the two dominant languages that erase her communities in her life in her own argument, Kerketta plays with surface and depth. The poems make visible what is meant to remain hidden, worlds deemed subterranean, exhausted, and exploitable. Her insurgent challenge to Hindi is especially striking. Even as she's celebrated within the Hindi literary world, her poems push against its very foundations. They enact, thus, what John Durham Peters calls switch points, moments when infrastructures become visible and felt. By describing an ecological language that takes on material properties of its environment, her verses reveal the layers of mediation that make Hindi/English possible, even as they threaten to erase what they represent. The questions Angor leaves us, the readers, with are several. How do we look at the flowers and inhabitants of the forest? How do we face the language on the page? Do we read it as a poem written in Hindi and English, both hegemonic languages responsible for the marginalization of the others, or do we read these as poems that persistently trouble language itself? I don't speak or read any of the languages that Kerketta does. And that perhaps is the point. By raising these questions, Angor brings us back to where I started this talk, the simultaneous profusion and erasure of languages and multilingualism, the simultaneous polysemy of language and my limitations as readers. Angor turns the reader's lack of knowledge into an ethical question. It reminds us that multilingualism is not only what we know, but also what we cannot know, what remains untranslatable, unheard, and unseen. How we tell the story of a language, especially in India, is not a question with a simple answer. How we tell the story of a language is also the foundational question, the very measure of my expertise in the disciplines and fields that I work within: comparative literature, post-colonial studies, area studies. And how we tell the story of language loss, of linguistic phonocide, is also a profoundly urgent question. Reading and writing multilingually in this context of proliferating hows can challenge the Anglocentrism of the global literary marketplace and the equivalence between a nation and language. Multilingual methods resist the compulsory monolingualism of colonial and neocolonial states and scholarly institutions invested in linguistic mastery and absolute translatability, reminding us that a language is always many. But, and this is what I want to stress as I conclude, we must remember that notions of multilingualism also rest on the same countability and cohesion of languages. We can't count without assuming languages to be discrete, and we cannot think linguistic discreteness without ascribing to some kind of monolingual logic. Kerketta's poetry gestures elsewhere. It suggests that if we attend to mediation, to the page, the voice, the forest, the infrastructures of readings, we might learn to see languages not as bounded entities, but as relations in motion. By facing the materiality of the page, by tracing how one language leans on another, by asking, how do we know what we know, we might take multilingualism as a method beyond countability, one that ushers counter-epistemologies, not of how languages die, but how they live, how they persist, and how they might be found. Thank you.
Thanks. That was very